At the memorial dinner, my grandfather set down his fork and looked at me the way you look at someone right before you say a thing that can't be taken back. The dining room smelled like pot roast, and the lemon oil my mother polishes the good table with, ordinary, safe. Then he leaned in, close enough that I could see the tremor in his hand, and said, "The money your grandmother left you, $250,000. Where did it go?" I forgot how to swallow. My glass was halfway to my mouth and I just held it there, suspended like my body had unplugged from the wall. "What money?" I said. My voice came out small. "Grandpa, I never." Across the table, my brother's face drained of color so fast I thought he might pass out into the mashed potatoes. 30 minutes later, when red and blue light started sliding across the dining room curtains, I understood that I hadn't walked into a family dinner. I'd walked into a trap that had already sprung. I just hadn't been the one it was set for. My name doesn't matter as much as hers does, so let me start with my grandmother. I'm 31. I've spent the last 6 years as a pediatric nurse in Denver, working nights in a unit where you learn very fast that people show you who they are when things fall apart. I'm good at staying steady. I've held a father's hand while his kid coded, kept my voice level, kept my face calm, and cried in my car afterward where no one could see. That skill matters later, so remember it. I grew up outside Cleveland, in one of those suburbs where the houses all have the same porch and everyone knows whose car is whose. My mother raised my brother and me mostly on her own after my dad left when I was 9, and if I'm being fair about it, she did the practical parts well. Bills paid, lights on, coats that fit, but love in my mother's house was never split down the middle. It was weighted. My brother got the bigger half, and he got it so consistently that I stopped noticing. It was strange until I was old enough to visit other families and see that the scale could sit level. My grandmother was the one who caught the difference and quietly tried to fix it. Her name was Opal, and she was the kind of woman who kept butterscotch in her coat pocket and $100 bill folded in the lining for emergencies that somehow always became my emergencies and never my brother's. When I was little, she'd take me to the bakery on Lee Road on Saturday mornings, buy me a cinnamon roll the size of my face, and let me watch the man in the window braid the dough. I told her, once 6 years old and sticky-fingered, that I wanted to make bread when I grew up. She didn't laugh. She said, "Then you'll make the best bread in Ohio, and I'll be your first customer." That never left me. Even through nursing school, even through the night shifts, I kept a notebook full of recipes and a folder on my laptop titled Someday, with layouts for a little corner bakery, warm light, a chalkboard menu. Kids watching dough get braided in the window the way I used to. My grandmother knew all of it. She was the only one I ever told out loud, because saying it to anyone else felt like handing them something breakable. She got sick 2 winters ago. Slow at first, then not slow at all. My brother lived 20 minutes from her. I lived a 2-hour flight away. And yet I was the one who used every scrap of paid time off and every red-eye I could afford to sit in that hospital room, to learn the names of her medications, to argue with insurance, to hold a straw to her mouth. My brother came by on Sundays, stayed 40 minutes, and posted a photo of the two of them that got a lot of hearts from people who thought he was a saint. My mother told everyone at church how devoted he was. I didn't mind. I'd stopped keeping score a long time ago. Or I thought I had. Grandma passed in March. Quietly, in the early morning, with my hand on hers, I flew home for the funeral, flew back to Denver 2 days later because a nurse doesn't get bereavement forever, and I went numb the way you do. I figured that was the end of the hard part. 3 weeks later, my mother called to tell me the family was planning a memorial dinner for the 6-month mark. Grandma had wanted it that way, apparently. No black clothes, no crying in a church basement. A meal at the house with the people who loved her. My grandfather, Grandma's husband of 52 years, still sharp as a tack at 76, was insisting on hosting it himself. I said of course I'd come. I booked the flight that night. Now here's where it starts to turn, and I need you to notice the exact moment, because I almost missed it. 4 days before the dinner, I was at work, prepping for a shift, when my phone lit up with my brother's name. He never calls me. We text, maybe, on birthdays, so the call itself put a little cold spot in my chest before I even answered. "Hey," he said, and his voice had this bright, hurried quality, like a salesman who's already decided you're going to say no. "Listen, don't buy that plane ticket yet. I already bought it." A pause. "Well, you can get a refund, right? The dinner's off?" "Off?" I set down the alcohol wipes I'd been stacking. "Grandpa's been planning it for weeks. Mom said he was doing the whole thing himself." "Yeah, that's the problem. It's too much for him. He's not doing great, honestly. We think it's better to just do something small, local. You don't need to fly all the way out. I'll FaceTime you in." I should tell you that my grandfather had run marathons into his 60s and still shoveled his own driveway. "He's not doing great" did not sound like my grandfather. It sounded like a line. "What's wrong with him?" I asked. "Just old, you know, tired. Look, I gotta run, but don't waste the money on the flight. Trust me." And he hung up before I could answer, which is a thing people do when they can't afford follow-up questions. I stood in that supply room holding my phone and felt something I hadn't felt since I was a kid at the bottom of that weighted scale. The feeling of being managed, of being handled, of being the last one told and told a version. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my aunt. My aunt is my grandfather's younger sister, and she is the one person in my family who has never once played a side. She's 72, drives a truck, swears like a sailor, and adored my grandmother. If anyone knew what was really happening, it was her. "Cancelled?" she barked, and I heard her set down whatever she was doing. "Who told you it's cancelled?" "My brother," he said. "Grandpa's not up for it." There was a silence on the line that had weight to it. "Honey," she said, "slow now. I had lunch with your grandfather yesterday. He drove himself. He's already ordered the flowers and he's arguing with the caterer about whether there'll be enough gravy. That dinner is happening. He's counting the chairs." The cold spot in my chest spread out into my whole body. "Why would my brother tell me it's cancelled?" I said, but even as I asked it, some part of me already knew the shape of the answer without the details. "I don't know," my aunt said, "but you get on that plane, and you don't tell a single soul you're coming." I didn't sleep much the next few nights. I kept replaying my brother's voice, that bright, hurried salesman tone, and turning it over like a stone, looking at the underside. I opened the online portal for my grandmother's estate. I'd been given login access months ago, back when I was the one handling her bills, and no one had ever thought to take it away. I didn't fully know what I was looking for. I just had the sick, itchy sense that something was wrong that I'd been too tired and too grieving to see. There was an account there, a trust account in my grandmother's name, with my name listed as beneficiary. $250,000, the statement said, established 18 months ago. And then, in the transaction history over the last 4 months, the exact 4 months I'd been flying back and forth and holding a straw to her lips. A series of withdrawals. Big ones. Draining it down like water through a cracked glass, the balance now read $411. I want to be honest about what I did in that moment, because it's the whole point of this. I didn't scream. I didn't call my brother and rage into the phone. I sat very still at my kitchen table in Denver, the way I sit still at a bedside when the numbers on the monitor go wrong, and I made myself think. Because here's the thing about my grandmother's gift that I only fully understood staring at that screen. She'd known. She'd known which grandchild would fly across the country and which one would come by for 40 minutes on Sundays. She'd set that money aside for me specifically, and she'd set it up so it wouldn't get lost in the general estate my mother and my brother would divide. It was hers to give, and she gave it to me on purpose with love, and someone had emptied it while she was dying. I didn't confront anyone. I printed everything, every statement, every transaction, every date. I put it in a folder. Then I called my aunt back and told her exactly what I'd found, and I heard her go very quiet and then very cold. "You bring that folder," she said. "You bring every page, and you let me handle the rest before you get here. Your grandfather needs to know, and he needs to hear it from someone who can prove it." "He'll be devastated," I said. "He'll be a lot of things," my aunt said. "But he loved that woman more than his own life, and he loves you like his own. You let him decide what to do with the truth. Don't you dare protect the people who did this by keeping it from him." I flew into Cleveland on the morning of the dinner. My aunt picked me up so my rental wouldn't tip anyone off, and we drove to her place first. I sat at her kitchen table, the same butterscotch smell as my grandmother's coat, because they were sisters-in-law who bought the same candy for 40 years. And I laid out the folder, and I watched a 72-year-old woman's jaw set like concrete. Then she made a phone call I didn't fully hear the start of, stepping into the other room, and when she came back she said, "The estate attorney is meeting us at your grandfather's house at 4. Before dinner, and she's bringing someone?" "Someone?" "There's a signature on one of those withdrawal authorizations," my aunt said. "A signature that's supposed to be your grandmother's. Except your grandmother couldn't hold a pen for the last 2 months of her life. You know that. You were there." She tapped the folder. "That's not a family disagreement, honey. That's forgery, and forgery is a crime." We got to my grandfather's house at 3:45. My grandmother's roses were still blooming along the front walk because he'd kept watering them. The estate attorney, a compact, unsmiling woman named Ms. Farrow, was already there, and with her was a plainclothes detective who introduced himself as Detective Halverson and shook my hand like he was sorry to be doing it. My grandfather opened the door in his good cardigan, and when he saw me, his whole face lit up. "There she is. There's my girl. I thought your brother said you couldn't make it." And then he saw the attorney behind me, and the detective behind her, and the folder in my hands, and the light in his face changed into something older and harder. We sat in his study, the 4 of us, and I gave him the folder. My aunt held his other hand. I watched a man who'd buried his wife 6 months ago read, line by line, the record of his grandsons draining the money she'd set aside for me, and I watched him understand it fully, and I have never in my life seen a person hold that much fury so quietly. He didn't yell. He set the folder down on his knee, smoothed it flat with one shaking hand, and he said, "How long until the guests arrive?" 40 minutes, my aunt said. "Good," my grandfather said. "Then everyone will be here." Asms. Farrow started to caution him that he should let the attorneys handle it, that a public scene wasn't strategically necessary. And my grandfather looked at her with those pale, steady eyes and said, "My wife spent her whole life keeping the peace in this family so no one would have to feel uncomfortable at dinner. She's not here to keep it anymore. So tonight we're going to have the uncomfortable dinner she never got to have." Detective Halverson said he'd wait outside in his car and come in when called. Miss Farrow said she'd stay. My aunt squeezed my hand and said, "You okay?" I nodded once. It was the truth. The numb was gone. In its place was the flat, clear calm I get on the worst nights on the unit, the calm that isn't the absence of feeling but the mastery of it. The guests came. Aunts and cousins and old church friends of my grandmother's, all in soft colors like my grandmother had wanted, carrying casseroles and photos and small kind stories. My mother arrived with her hair done and a store-bought pie and a smile she wore like a coat. When she saw me, she froze for half a second, just half a second, and then covered it. "You made it," she said. "I thought there was some confusion about the date." "No confusion," I said. "I'm right where I'm supposed to be." And then my brother came in, my sister-in-law on his arm, and I understood in one glance where $250,000 had gone. He was wearing a watch I could have paid 3 months of rent with. She had diamond studs the size of corn kernels and a tan that doesn't come from Cleveland in October. My aunt had told me they'd spent August in Cabo. My brother saw me across the room and his salesman's smile flickered, just for an instant, the way it had on the phone, and then he recovered and came over and hugged me stiffly and said, "Hey, you came all this way. That's crazy, I told you not to bother." "I know you did," I said. We sat down to eat. My grandfather sat at the head of the table, in the chair he'd sat in for 50 years, and he let the meal go on for a while. He let people tell their stories about Grandma. He let my mother talk about how devoted my brother had been, sitting there in his stolen watch. He let the room be warm and ordinary and full of the smell of pot roast and lemon oil. And then, when the plates were mostly empty and someone had just refilled the wine, my grandfather picked up his fork, set it back down, and looked at me. Which is where I began. The money your grandmother left you, he said, into a table that had gone, still because everyone can feel when the temperature drops. $250,000. Where did it go? What money? I said. Grandpa, I never got any money. My brother's face went white. My grandfather turned to look at him, slowly, the whole table following his eyes, like iron filings following a magnet. I'm asking her, he said, though he was looking straight at my brother now, but you can answer if you'd like. Your grandmother set up a trust, $250,000 in her own name with your sister as beneficiary, for a bakery. She wanted her to have her bakery. His voice never rose. That was the terrible part. The account was emptied over the last 4 months, so somebody at this table is going to tell me where it went. The silence had a sound to it. The candles seemed to burn slower. My mother reached for her wine glass and didn't drink from it. My sister-in-law's hand went up to touch one of those diamonds like she wanted to hide it and couldn't remember how. And my brother said the thing that I think about now, the thing that told me he'd never once believed he was doing anything wrong, which is somehow worse than if he'd known. That account wasn't just hers, he said. Grandma had me listed as a signer. Back when she got sick, somebody had to be able to move money for her, and I was the one who was here. So legally that money was, it was accessible to me. I was managing it. You were managing it into a watch, my aunt said from her end of the table. He didn't even look at her. He kept talking to my grandfather, and this is the part I want you to notice, because the version of this story I saw in 100 videos always has the guilty person contradicting themselves, saying I thought it was mine, and then I was only borrowing, and then I'll pay it back, tripping over their own lies. My brother didn't do that. My brother had one story and he believed it, and that was scarier. I was going to put it back, he said. That was always the plan. I hit a rough patch with the flips. The market turned, it wasn't my fault, and I borrowed against the account to stay afloat, and I was going to replace every dollar before anyone needed it. She wasn't going to use it anyway. She was. He caught himself, but not fast enough. She was sick. She wasn't opening any bakery, and it's not like it was going to a stranger, it's family. It was supposed to come to us eventually anyway. It wasn't coming to you, my grandfather said. She wrote your sister's name on it. Not yours, not your mother's. Hers. He tapped the table once, gently. You keep saying us. There is no us on that account, you knew that. That's why you told your sister the dinner was canceled. So she'd never fly out, never look, never find it empty until the money was long gone and you had a story ready. My mother stood up. Her smile was gone and something brittle had come in behind it. Dad, please. Not here. Not in front of everyone. We can work this out privately as a family. Privately, my grandfather repeated, and for the first time there was an edge in it. Privately is how it happened. Privately is how everything's always been handled in this family. Your daughter flew home 4 times to sit with your mother while she died. Your son came by on Sundays and emptied her savings. And you? He looked at my mother and I saw her flinch. You knew, didn't you? My mother didn't answer, and her not answering filled the whole room. That's when my aunt slid the folder down the length of the table. It stopped in front of my grandfather, but everyone could see it. Bank statements, she said, to the room, to the church friends and the cousins, and the woman who'd brought the casserole. Every withdrawal, every date, and a withdrawal authorization with a signature on it that's supposed to be my sister-in-law's. Except she couldn't hold a pen for the last 2 months of her life. I know because I fed her applesauce with a spoon, so that signature is a forgery. And that, my aunt looked at my brother, and her voice did not shake at all, is not a family disagreement. That's a felony. My brother's mouth opened. For the first time, the story failed him. The notary someone must have. There was a notary? Miss Farrow said, speaking for the first time, and my brother realized too late that the calm woman in the corner was a lawyer, and he shut his mouth. My grandfather stood. He was not a large man, but the whole room got smaller around him. He took his phone out of his cardigan pocket, and my mother said, Dad, don't. And my sister-in-law started to cry, and my brother said, "Grandpa, come on, this is insane. I'll pay it back. I'll pay all of it back right now." "You can't pay back what you stole from a dying woman," my grandfather said. "You can only give back the money. That's not the same thing." And he looked at me, just for a second, and something passed between us that I'll keep for the rest of my life. Then he said quietly, into the phone, "You can come in now, detective." The front door opened, and 30 seconds later, red and blue light began to slide across my grandmother's curtains. I've watched a lot of these stories where the police show up, and it's all sirens and drama and handcuffs at the table. It wasn't like that. It was worse in how ordinary it was. Detective Halverson came in, took his hat off out of respect for the memorial photos on the mantel, and said, "Folks, I'm going to need a few minutes of some people's time." He wasn't cruel about it. He didn't have to be. The facts did all the work. My brother tried the borrowing story again, and then the somebody must-have story, and Detective Halverson just wrote it all down in a little notebook, unhurried, and the more my brother talked, the worse it got for him. Because a consistent story about why you took the money is still a story about how you took the money. My sister-in-law kept saying, "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know where it came from." And maybe that was even true. She took off the diamond studs right there at the table and set them down next to her plate like they'd started to burn her. My mother said the sentence I keep coming back to. She said, "He's my son." Like that was a legal argument. Like that was a fact that should reorganize the universe. And my grandfather looked at her with more sadness than anger and said, "She was my granddaughter too. They were both my grandchildren. I managed to love them the same." Why couldn't you? My mother didn't have an answer for that either. They took statements from everyone. When it was my turn, Detective Halverson led me into my grandfather's study, the one with the good books and the smell of old paper, and he set a little recorder on the desk and said, "In your own words, take your time." I told him about the phone call, about being told the dinner was canceled, about calling my aunt and finding out it wasn't, about logging into the account I still had access to and watching $250,000 turn into $411 over the months I'd been flying home to say goodbye. I told it flat and clean, the way I'd tell a doctor a set of vitals, because that's the only way I could get through it without my voice cracking. "You held up pretty well out there," Detective Halverson said when I finished. "Most people, that kind of thing at the dinner table, they lose it." "I've had practice," I said. "Losing it doesn't help anybody. It just gives people something to point at later." Look how she overreacted. I looked at the recorder. I didn't want to be the story. I wanted the money to be the story. He nodded like that made sense to him and turned the recorder off. When I came back out, the guests had mostly gone, drifting off into the October dark in awkward little clusters, and the house felt scrubbed of all its warmth. My grandmother's roses were still blooming out front for no one. My brother was sitting very still with his hands flat on the table, like the surface was the only solid thing left. My mother stood behind him with one hand on his shoulder, and she was looking at me, and I couldn't read what was in her face. And I decided I didn't need to. Detective Halverson explained that no one was being arrested that night. "That's not how forgery and theft of this size usually goes," he said. "It goes to the district attorney, it goes to charges, it goes slow." But my brother would be hearing from them. And my mother, because there were questions about what she'd known and when, would be hearing from them too. "You can't do this to your own family," my mother said to my grandfather, and her voice finally broke. "I didn't do this," my grandfather said. "You keep saying I'm doing this to the family. I'm the only one at this table who didn't do anything to the family." He was so tired when he said it. "Your mother did the thing to this family. She left love in a bank account with a name on it, and someone scratched the name out." My brother looked up at me then, and his eyes were wet, and he said the last thing. The thing they always say. "Say something. Tell them you don't want to do this. You're my sister." And I found that I wasn't angry anymore. I was just very, very clear. "I already said something," I told him. "I flew home 4 times and sat with her and told you every week how she was doing, and you never once asked. That was me saying something. You just weren't listening." I picked up my grandmother's folder off the table, the one with all the pages that told the truth she couldn't tell anymore. I'm not doing this to you, you did this. I'm just the one who finally stopped keeping it quiet. They left, not in handcuffs, not with sirens, just out the front door into the night, my brother and my mother, my sister-in-law, trailing behind with her diamonds in her purse and her marriage, I found out later, already ending. The door closed with a small, hollow click, and then the house was quiet in a way it hadn't been all night. No performances, no managed versions, just my grandfather and my aunt and me, and a table full of dishes, and the memorial photos of my grandmother watching over all of it with that little butterscotch smile. I started clearing plates because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. My grandfather sat down heavily in his chair and pressed the heels of his palms into his eyes for a long moment. My aunt put her hand on his back. "You did the right thing," she said. "I know," he said. "That's the part nobody warns you about. How the right thing can feel exactly like a loss." I brought him a cup of tea, and he wrapped both hands around it, and he looked at me over the rim, and after a while he said, "She really wanted you to have that bakery. She talked about it. She used to say, when she opens it, I'll drive there myself for the first loaf, even if my knees have to be carried." He smiled a little. "She was going to be your first customer." I had to sit down when he said that. Here's what happened after, because I know how much I always wanted to know the after when it was someone else's story. The money didn't come back all at once, and some of it never came back at all. You can't unspend a trip to Cabo. But there was a house my brother owned that wasn't underwater, and there were cars, and there was a court that ordered restitution once the forgery charge went through, because the forged signature was the thing that turned it from an ugly family fight into a crime the state cared about. He pleaded to it eventually. No prison, in the end. First offense, restitution agreed, but a felony on his record, which for a man who made his living convincing people to trust him with money, turned out to be its own kind of sentence. Last I heard, he was selling cars, not flipping houses, and I don't say that with any joy. There's no joy in it. There's just the flat relief of a thing set right. My mother was never charged. The DA couldn't prove she'd known enough, early enough. But something between her and my grandfather broke that night that I don't think ever mended. She calls me, sometimes, and the calls are careful and thin, and I answer them because my grandmother would have wanted me to, and I keep them short because I have to protect the calm I worked so hard to earn. She's never once said she was sorry. She said, "He's my son at that table, and I think that's the truest thing she'll ever tell me about who she is." My sister-in-law left my brother within the year. I don't know her well, but I sent her a note when I heard, because I remembered the way she'd set those diamonds down next to her plate like they'd started to burn her, and I thought that meant something. My aunt and I talk every week now. She's the family I chose to keep. And my grandfather is the reason I can tell this story without it curdling into bitterness, because he showed me, at 76, with his heart broken twice over, that loving someone means you don't let people hurt them and call it peace. He wore my grandmother's watch to every court date. He said it made him feel like she was there. The money that came back, plus what I'd saved on my own, was enough. Barely, but enough. I opened the bakery this past spring on a corner in Denver with Good Morning Light exactly 2 years after she died. I hung a chalkboard menu, and I put a braiding table in the front window where kids can watch the dough get folded over itself the way I used to watch on Lee Road. I named it Opals. My grandfather couldn't fly out for the opening. His knees, finally, the way he joked about hers. But my aunt drove him. 2 days on the interstate in her truck, a 76-year-old man and his 72-year-old sister, and a tin of butterscotch between them on the bench seat. He walked in the first morning we opened, before the rush, and he stood in the middle of the shop and looked at the light and the flour and the chalkboard, and his eyes filled up. "She was supposed to be your first customers," he said. "I know," I told him. "So I saved it for her." And I went behind the counter and I brought out the first loaf out of the first batch, still warm, and I set it on the table by the window in the good light. next to a photo of a woman with butterscotch in her coat pocket and a folded $100 bill in the lining for emergencies that were only ever mine. My grandfather bought it. He insisted on paying cash, and he wouldn't take the change. He said the first loaf was hers, and he was only buying it on her behalf, and that made him the second customer, and he'd take that. He sat by the window and ate it slow, and the morning went on around us, ordinary and warm, the way she'd wanted everything to be. And I stood behind the counter in the shop she believed in before I did, and I thought about how they'd tried to erase me quietly, over the phone, with a canceled dinner and a forged name, and how quiet had always been the weapon they used on me. They should have known better. I spend my life in rooms where everything is falling apart, and the only thing that saves anyone is the person who stays calm enough to see clearly. They mistook my quiet for weakness for 31 years. It was never weakness. It was just me, holding still, waiting for the light to hit the truth.